Hi everybody, and welcome again to today's webinar. Apologies for keeping you on hold for a minute there. So today's webinar is hosted by the ISEAL Alliance and is part of our working group on improving collaboration between sustainable public procurement and sustainability labels and standards, which is part of the 10YFP, SPP, and CI programs. My name is David Dallander. I am the Senior Coordinator at the ISEAL Alliance, and today we will be sharing insights and experiences on how sustainable procurement can tackle deforestation and scale up sustainable management of forests. So we have two expert speakers with us today, and before giving you an overview of our lineup, let me just remind you that you're all muted at this point, and if you have any questions or comments, you can write them in the questions box in your webinar panel, and we will try to address them during the Q&A session of the webinar. We will also share the slides and the recording after this webinar. So before getting into today's main theme, we will first hear two short introductions and updates from the coordination desks of the Sustainable Public Procurement Program and the Consumer Information Program. I have just noticed that unfortunately, really from the Consumer Information Program can join us today. So we will only have the updates from the Sustainable Public Procurement Program, which will be presented by Laura. Then I will move on to the theme of the day and set the stage for our expert speakers by highlighting key trends and definitions around sustainable forest management, illegal wood procurement, and zero deforestation commitments. Then we will move on to our first guest speaker, which is Annie Adams from EFECA, which is a consultancy with decades of experience in working with governments and private companies on sustainable procurement policies. And she will highlight experiences and lessons UK procurement policy. Then we will move on to John Hunt, who is Chief Advocacy Officer at the Stewardship Council, and he will talk a bit more in depth private certification and private sustainability standards, strengthen management and how public procurers can use these standards. Moving on, I will now hand over the floor to Laura, who will give us a quick update of the Sustainable Public Program of the 10YFP. Laura?
Yes, thank you, David. So this working group on eco-labels and sustainability standards is coordinating the framework of two different 10YP programs. So on the one hand is the Consumer Information Program, and on the other, the Sustainable Public Procurement Program. And I don't know if we can show the work plan for the SPP program on screen. But we have work areas, and one of them, the fourth one, focus on collaborating with the framework of this work area in particular. Yeah, here we go. That we find working group 4B. And if we can move to the next slide, I would like to give you a few updates about the SPP program very quickly. So we just very recently presented a webinar about our upcoming report that's going to the 2017 Global Review on Sustainable Public Procurement. So a report it's coming out in a few weeks, and you can find the webinar on the Library of Webinars on the YouTube channel. Where we explain sort of what the goal of the study was and what the research steps taken were. So I invite you to check that out if you're interested in the study. We also recently published our latest newsletter, the 8th one, which is also available on our website. And in this SAP Clearinghouse website, which I also invite you to keep an eye on, as we always have new updates on this page on our program. So thank you very much. That was what I had to say.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. So moving on to the thematic part of our webinar today, we will be talking about deforestation, legal wood, and sustainable forest management. And I will set the stage just by shortly highlighting some key definitions and trends in this area, but I also wanted to set the stage by bringing into focus why we are addressing this topic and why it is still quite high up the agenda of both governments and companies. So deforestation has been a long-standing problem, but still we see at an alarming rate deforestation occurring, largely in tropical countries and mainly due to agricultural conversion. And all forecasts predict that this pressure on forested area will continue and will only increase. The impacts of that are quite significant, not only in terms of climate change, but also in terms of a range of other factors, including biodiversity, water integrity, soil erosion, desertification, as well as human livelihoods. So the FAO estimated in 2014 that about 13 million people are employed in the formal forestry sector, and the World Bank estimates that there's a revenue loss of about $10 billion a year from illegal logging. So if you look at the different responses that have been developed over the past decades, which relate to how sourcing and procurement policies can address deforestation, we can summarize these into three strands. So first, we have sustainable forest management and agriculture, for which standards and certification systems have been developed, which enable procurers to buy sustainable products from either sustainable managed forests or farms. Secondly, we have a range of government actions and regulations which aim to stop the trade and procurement of illegal timber. And lastly, we have more recently, we have seen the adoption of zero deforestation commitments by both companies and more recently also governments, which are pledges to prevent any further deforestation caused by supply chain policies. So I will briefly go into each of these three responses to deforestation, and I will try to highlight some definitions and key differences, and at the same time I will try to keep it quite general. So if there are any important details that have to be addressed, you can put them in the comment box and we can address them at the end of the webinar. So moving on to zero deforestation commitments, this is important for a number of reasons, and it has been a trend that I think that started in the private sector, most notably with the Consumer Goods Forum in 2010, making a commitment towards zero deforestation by 2020. But also recently we have seen the government of Norway in June of 2016 making a commitment to be the first zero deforestation, to have the first zero deforestation procurement policy. Now there's a few very important nuances to understand when talking about zero deforestation. I will not get into these three definitions I have put on the slides, but it is quite important for procurers to understand that zero deforestation can mean a range of different things, and that this definition is still quickly evolving. So we have been in touch with the government of Norway to explain how they are going to implement a zero deforestation policy in their public procurement policies, and they have gotten back to us that they are still working and developing this policy. So we are looking to give an update on that at a later stage when more of this is publicly available and known. Now, if we move on to the second range of of responses to deforestation. These evolve around stopping the trade and procurement of illegal timber. And there we can see that over the past decade or more, a number of countries and regions such as the EU have taken action and have set in place regulations that effectively ban the trade and import of illegal wood into their jurisdictions. Now, it's important to note that what is considered illegal wood or illegal timber is different depending on the piece of legislation or regulation you are looking at. And what is also important for public procurers to keep in mind is that when legislation is based on a definition of illegal wood that is based on the country of harvest, then you are looking at a variety of levels of what illegal actually looks like. In addition, in addition of these different definitions, we also have to understand that there's different ways to verify compliance with the different regulations. And I will not go too deep into these differences, but they are quite important. And I think it's a key element for public procurers to keep in mind. And at the same time, this webinar will not be only about illegal timber or focusing on, for example, the importance of the EU timber regulation and the FLEGT action plan. Then moving on to sustainable forest management, here it's key to keep in mind that sustainable forest management aims to go beyond the minimum legislative basis, which is set in national regulations, and it can go beyond this legislation by looking at various areas, including the customary rights of local populations and communities. It can also focus more on the inclusive and multi-stakeholder management of forests or farms. Look also at more stringent social standards as well as environmental protection requirements. In the past, there have been various ways in how sustainable forest management has been defined. Some of the most prominent and practical ways have been established through private sustainability standards and certification schemes. And John from the Forest Stewardship Council later in this webinar will elaborate on that. And it's also important to keep in mind that various regional processes are taking place. For public procurers, it's important to keep in mind that not only are there different definitions of sustainable forestry management, but there's also different ways to measure this performance. And in using sustainability standards, there is a difference in the credibility and legitimacy of these sustainability standard and certification schemes. So when defining a sustainable timber procurement policy, it is necessary to keep both in mind the legality and sustainability elements. And one good example here is the UK timber policy, which Annie will elaborate on further, which sets out very clearly, of course, that it has to meet the legality requirements of the EU timber regulation, and timber has to come from a forest which is managed in accordance with a definition of sustainable that meets a range of different requirements. So I will just end here with this very short overview and emphasize that there's a range of different definitions, and the area of sustainable timber procurement or tackling deforestation through procurement is quite complex. And in that sense, there is a need for expertise and knowledge sharing between public procurers, standard systems, and experts to actually have these policies implemented. And now this is a perfect moment to hand over the floor to Annie, which has worked in this area for a number of years. So please, Annie, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, David. So my name's Annie Adams. I'm a principal consultant at a small natural resource consultancy firm called EFECA. We were founded in 2009. David, if you want to skip to the next slide. Very briefly, just to give you a flavour of the sort of things we do, and I won't spend too long on this. We work across different commodities. So we do a lot of work in the forest and timber sector, but we also work, for example, in palm oil, as well as looking now at soy and cocoa, and also looking at the wood fuel sector as well. We do a variety of different support services. So, for example, working with the European Commission in the last couple of years, helping them review the EU timber regulation and its effectiveness, to supporting Department for International Development on their Partnerships for Forests programme, and technical support to the Amsterdam Declaration Secretariat, which is looking specifically at sustainable palm oil across Europe, and various different things, strategic review and programme design. And of course, we do a lot of training and technical support to the private sector. So working with companies such as Kingfisher, who are an international retail company, Unilever on their packaging, Smurfit Kappa, Samsung Electronics, etc. So a whole different variety, as well as various different donors as well. So people are very welcome to send me chat messages, but also, of course, to send me emails if they've got questions about our work, but that's not the purpose of this presentation. So if you want to move on, David, to the next slide. So EFECA delivered the central point of expertise on timber called CPET from 2012 to 2016, when the contract came to an end. Previous to EFECA delivering it, consultancy firm, which some of you may know very well, ProForest, delivered CPET for the UK government. From 2012, as well as looking at the UK government's timber procurement policy, I'm going to be introducing lots of acronyms. I do apologise. The timber procurement policy of the UK government is called the TPP. We also looked at palm oil and wood fuel requirements for UK procurement in terms of palm oil, and for all buyers and suppliers of wood fuel in the UK market. CPET was originally established after some high-profile attacks by different NGOs and international pressure. So you can see in the bottom right some people in high-vis jackets carrying a internal door which has got an FSC label on it. If you look carefully, you might just make out part of a Greenpeace logo on those high-vis jackets. And this is because Greenpeace broke in to the Department for the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs new offices during construction, took out some of the Moranti hardwood doors that potentially were from illegal sources and had no proof of sustainability or legality, and replaced them with FSC certified doors from B&Q, which was slightly embarrassing, and did gather rather a lot of media attention, including on Newsnight, which is quite a well-known news programme on the BBC. So the government had to establish a timber procurement policy, which originally mandated legality with a preference for sustainability, and evolved over time to require legal and sustainable timber. CPET supported the implementation of the timber procurement policy through an email and telephone helpline and website with support materials, as well as training workshops and newsletters, and bespoke support for particular types of evidence, which I will come on to in a while. CPET was also responsible for coordinating a review of particular types of evidence, which I'll also touch on later. We also did, oh, and I do apologise, there's some wrapping of text problems that we've got there, but we also supported EU member states in a development of a non-paper, so basically looking at what the different EU member states were doing in terms of public procurement, and I have a slide on that which I'll just touch on briefly later. So David, if you could move on to the next slide. Okay, so the timber procurement policy statement is that only timber and wood-derived products originating from an independently verifiable, legal and sustainable source, which can include from a licensed FLEGT in that paragraph quite deliberately. I think we probably spent a few hundred hours with public procurement lawyers at DEFRA working on that statement, and it's legally correct, but perhaps not quite so easy to read. And thankfully, there is a lot of support documentation which goes to explain a little bit about it. If we move to the next slide, I think I'll just touch briefly on other member states. So a number of member states do have timber procurement policies, not just the UK. The Dutch timber procurement policy is probably one of the most well-known and the most thoroughly developed in terms of additional support services and in terms of detail sitting behind their policy. And then we've got the Germans, which are very straightforward in their requirements, requiring FSC or PFC, and the Danes. So the Dutch and the Danes, together with the UK, have very, very similar approaches, whereas the Germans were slightly different. And of course, this has evolved since we did this work. So there probably are an increased number of member state timber procurement policies, which is obviously a very welcome development indeed. And of course, as well as national procurement policies by governments, which go well beyond just Europe, there are a number of regional and city procurement policies as well as within the UK, I think several hundred local authorities that have their own procurement policies in place. Okay, so that's just a flavour looking outside the UK and how the UK's public procurement policy compares. I'm very happy to provide a bit more detail on that in chat or by email, although I think that it'll be really interesting to have a look at the report that ISEAL are going to be publishing soon. I think that's due out next week, isn't it? The 2017 Global Review of Sustainable Public Procurement, and that undoubtedly will also provide some really interesting insight into those issues. So David, if we move on a slide. Okay, so there are various different support services for implementing the UK government's timber procurement policy. We have various different tools available. Essentially, you need to implement 6 steps in order to be able to apply the policy as a public procurer. First of all, of course, is to make sure that you're appropriately identifying the need. And from a UK government point of view, this is really focusing more broadly on sustainable procurement. Do you actually need to procure the item? There are, for example, a number of contracts for reusing furniture, for example. So there are warehouses of office furniture, government office furniture, to encourage reuse of furniture rather than procuring new furniture. There's also, for example, closed loop recycling of office paper. So really, before you think about timber procurement or paper procurement, it's thinking about whether or not you really need to be procuring anything. And then once you've appropriately decided your procurement process, then you need to make sure that you correctly specify what you want, and you correctly specify the implementation of the timber procurement policy using, we always recommend, model specification text. Different countries and member states have different interpretations of law in relation to public procurement. So if we're looking particularly within Europe, there is a procurement directive. Did somebody want to ask me a question? I think we were going to use the chat function, but if somebody has a burning question, they are very welcome to. No? Okay. So going back to what I was saying, talking about specification of requirements, the EC's Public Procurement Directive has some very specific obligations on public contracting authorities, and the UK government has taken a particular interpretation, which means that if you do not specify what you want in terms of legality and sustainability in the correct manner, then the UK government's view is that you are at risk of prosecution. Now, within the UK, there isn't a large body of evidence that this has occurred. However, I understand that there has been a couple of cases where things have gone to court, and also outside the UK as well. And again, we could touch on that later if necessary. So it's very important to make sure that public contracting authorities have appropriately specified their requirements. Depending on the kind, and I'm not going to go into the details here, of public procurement that you're conducting, you might carry out pre-qualification of suppliers, and it's important that you use the appropriate CPET guidance and support again at this point. So if somebody has a track record of implementing the timber procurement policy, then you can look at that track record, but you cannot penalise somebody simply because they do not have that track record. So you may or may not be doing that stage 3 pre-qualification. You certainly would be doing an invitation to tender, and we have model text for that before evaluating the tenders and going to contract management. Now, it's the UK government's view that it's during contract management that you actually assess evidence and put in place processes for monitoring compliance of a contract going forward. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Okay, so those are the kind of key steps of implementing the UK government's timber procurement policy, and that's aimed obviously at public buyers and specifically at central government buyers. Local authorities and education and hospitals, for example, are encouraged to comply there, but they are not mandated. So we're talking specifically about central government departments and their executive agencies, of which there are over 1,000. So it's still a very significant amount of the market, possibly over 10% of the total timber and paper purchase in the UK market as a whole. So still a very significant impact. If you move on to the next slide, David. Okay, so won't go into this detail. You can find it on the UK government's website. The Timber Procurement Advice Note, again, a bit of a labour of love with lawyers, and sets out relatively briefly those steps and then how to implement them. And provides some technical guidance, and that's available for both buyers and suppliers. Okay, and you can move on to the next slide. What's important to note is that the UK government's timber procurement policy requires legal and sustainable timber, and we need to be able to understand what we mean by legal and sustainable timber. And there are a couple of different forms of evidence that we can use, which I'll come on to in a second. But in order to judge whether or not that evidence meets the government's requirements, it's important to have a definition of legal and sustainable. So this was originally developed back in probably 2003 and 2004, and as David mentioned on one of his earlier slides, at that point it had initially looked at FSC principles and criteria. However, it's evolved significantly since that point. It's still aligned with best practice. So, for example, particularly the Forest Europe principles and criteria, which makes a lot of sense because the UK government is a signatory to Forest Europe. And they're separated out into criteria for legal and sustainable, and you can find those on the government website as well. And moving on to the next slide, David. So there, as I've touched on, are two different types of evidence. There is category A evidence, which are forest certification schemes, which are assessed by CPET against that definition of legal and sustainable that we've just briefly touched on. And the results of that assessment back in 2014 and 15 for FSC and PFC was that they both passed. The assessment was conducted by an independent panel of experts that CPET coordinated. So I oversaw and supported the independent technical panel, but they conducted the assessment themselves. It was a long process over about 9 months and required a lot of dialogue with both FSC and PFC and a review of evidence. However, I should make it very clear that it's a desk-based assessment looking at international documents that the schemes provide and are available publicly on their websites, and it does not look at implementation in the field, and there is no assessment of results in the field. So FSC and PFC are one of the key ways that you can demonstrate compliance with the timber procurement policy. However, you can also use other equivalent forms of evidence, which we've handily labelled Category B. Now, whilst this option is not does not have a significant uptake, it is important to be able to offer this option in order to be able to comply with the EC Procurement Directive. And we also feel that although forest certification is a very straightforward tool to use to demonstrate that your forest is managed sustainably, it should be possible to use other forms of evidence. However, it is very challenging to be able to do that. There are some simple routes for small woodlands within the UK, and in theory, small woodland owners outside the UK could use a similar approach. For large natural forest, however, effectively you would still need third-party verification at field level that they met the criteria for legal and sustainable. And given that those criteria are highly detailed, the reality is the amount of work involved for a larger forest in demonstrating Category B compliance is significant, and even could go potentially beyond requirements for FSC and PFC, and certainly needs to be equivalent, and that's really important and a legal requirement under the EC Procurement Directive. It's not an easy route. So if you move on now, David. So in terms of, I'm sorry, I don't know what's gone on with that line there. In terms of the impacts of timber procurement policy, back in 2010, EFECA supported the UK government in looking at the impacts of timber procurement policy. Had it worked? Did they still need one? So absolutely did the UK government's timber procurement policy, established in 2003, at that point act as a very significant leader in changing behaviour for both the public and the private sector, and most notably in terms of trade behaviour. So levels of illegal and, well, potentially illegal and certainly unsustainable timber coming onto the UK market in sort of the early 2000s was really high, and the level of legally and sustainably verified timber at that point was very low. I haven't got the figures to hand, but you'd probably be looking at under 25% on the market. And when you look perhaps at, say, 2012, 2014, you'd be well over 80% on the UK market as a whole in terms of legal and sustainably verified timber. So that's a really significant change in trade on the UK market, and the initial establishment of the UK government's timber procurement policy did act as a catalyst for change in the private sector. However, it's really important to note that this was very much through the actions of a number of different trade associations and individual private sector organisations, as well as local authorities and central government agencies working together along with certification schemes and various different agencies to bring this about. So in no way would the UK government lay claim to being responsible in the massive shift in terms of improvement of sustainable timber on the market in the UK, but it did act as a catalyst, we believe. The UK government is still seen, we believe, as a leader, both to the private sector and to other governments within the EU and further afield. Together with the Netherlands within Europe, we probably have the most detailed set of legal and sustainable criteria. The Netherlands perhaps now actually has gone into a more detailed process than ourselves, although we still achieve relatively similar outputs. However, one potential challenge, unfortunately, is the inconsistent application of the timber procurement policy across different government departments and by contractors. Now, because of the very significant uptake in the private sector, actually the vast majority of central government departments are buying legal and sustainable timber, but unfortunately, depending on the individual government department, they're not always requiring and then, most importantly, checking implementation and compliance with the UK government's timber procurement policy. There's a lot of really good work going on, but it is inconsistent in its application, which is a great shame, and there is some work to try to address that, but perhaps more work still needs to be done on that area. I just have one more slide on the impacts of timber procurement policy and I'm nearly done. So one thing that we have definitely found is that there is a preference for category A evidence for FSC and PFC certification, both amongst implementers in the public sector, but also particularly in terms of contractors providing evidence to the UK government. That's not very surprising. It's the simplest route. Using the category B route can take many months, and if it's not small woodland, you would be looking at spending probably an equivalent amount of resources or perhaps even more in trying to demonstrate compliance. So it's a particularly challenging area. So it's not surprising that there is a reliance on FSC and PFC as the main form of evidence. During the development of and implementation of the timber procurement policy since sort of early 2003, there's been a number of reviews of FSC and PFC with a number of findings demonstrating various different strengths, but also weaknesses and challenges for both schemes. That both schemes have worked very hard to address, along with, of course, all of the other challenges that they face. And we have seen significant revision of both FSC and PFC, by no means simply as a result of UK government timber procurement policy, but perhaps particularly in the mid-2000s and late 2000s, so 2008, particularly for PFC, we believe that some of the pressure coming out of our review and out of work that the Netherlands was doing did act as something of a catalyst for change, along with a lot of other pressures that both schemes were facing. There is potentially a bit of a bias in implementation of the timber procurement policy against tropical producers and smaller producers. So we found that it was quite common to specify temperate hardwoods and softwoods and try to avoid tropical hardwoods where there is generally a lower volume of certified material. However, that has significantly improved over the last probably 5 years, perhaps even 8 years, and it's not quite so much of a problem that it was when we originally did the impact assessment in 2010. I still think that there are a lot of barriers to small woodland owners, and demonstrating compliance with our detailed criteria is one of them for the UK government, but there are a number of challenges that small woodland owners face, and we could have many webinars talking just about that. So I've nearly finished. Wanted to make the point that, as our impact assessment found at the time, CPET did, the Central Point of Expertise, play a key role in implementation of the timber procurement policy, particularly in terms of the workshops and webinars and the helpline, particularly for actually the private sector. Although we certainly had uptake within the public sector, we actually had a greater uptake of our helpline and training workshops within the private sector. And we think that there has been some positive outputs from harmonising and lesson sharing across Europe as well. So overall, the UK government's timber procurement policy and requirement for legal and sustainability has allows both FSC and PFC and other equivalent forms of evidence, but we have very much seen that broadly speaking, the majority of the suppliers to the UK government will supply FSC or PFC certified material, and that the UK government timber procurement policy has had a positive impact in significantly increasing the amount on the market in the UK and as a leader within Europe and more widely, although there are many actors that have helped to influence that. So David, if we just move on, I think I'm probably on my last slide. Just briefly wanted to touch, and perhaps in retrospect this might have been a slide better earlier, to touch on UK government commitments related to forests and forestry, as well as the UK government's timber procurement policy, which is implemented through the UK government's Greening Government Commitments. It's another wonderful acronym GGC, which basically sets out, as well as sustainable procurement, various different requirements under, for example, transport, water, climate, emissions. We also have various different other commitments, so the UK Biodiversity Action Plan and the UK Forestry Standard. Within the UK, we have the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme, which did have equivalence with FSC UK. Actually, there's a review underway right at this moment, but hopefully that will continue to be the case after some improvements have been made. It's important to note that FSC probably has the greatest uptake in the UK compared to PFC in terms of forests. There's various different other commitments that the UK government has made within the UK, so Rural Development Programme, which is looking at creation and restoration. We actually have very little forests, as probably many people on the webinar today know. We cleared it during the Industrial Revolution and during the 16th and 17th century. What we have got left, a lot of it is unfortunately undermanaged. So larger forests are largely very well managed by either the Forestry Commission or by the private sector, but there is a lot of undermanagement in the smaller woodlands. So work is being done to improve that. Whether or not there's enough of that is perhaps an issue for contention. There's Woodland Carbon Code, which is particularly looking at how woodland can help to support and mitigate climate change. Importantly, from an international perspective, the UK government has, since 2003, supported the regional forest law enforcement and governance programmes, both through support for the FLEGT action plan at a European level and through capacity building in country and at regional level, for example, through Asia. So the Department for International provides a lot of funding and support and secondment of staff to those processes, which are at the moment affecting about 16 tropical producer countries who are key suppliers to the European market, but also more widely than the European market. And the hope is that through the FLEG action plan, there will be a significant improvement in forest governance, which will affect and improve trade in sustainable timber products, not just coming into Europe, but also globally as well. And then very briefly, as I mentioned, EFECA involved in supporting the Amsterdam Declaration, which a number of member states and Norway signed up to back in November last year, and specifically commits to sustainable palm oil, but also to look at other commodities. So that's not timber focused, but it very much does have an impact on forests, because it's really about deforestation and commodities which contribute to deforestation and how that can be addressed through sustainable consumption. Okay, so I think that is my final slide, David. Yeah. So if you've got any questions, then through the chat function, when David indicates, you're very welcome to send me some questions. Otherwise, you're welcome to do it by email as well, as you prefer. And I hope you found that useful. I'm looking forward to hearing from John on some more views on sustainable procurement and certification.
Well, thank you very much, Annie, for this really deep insights from the UK and the implementation of the UK timber procurement policy. So in the middle of your webinar, I noticed that really from the CI coordination desk has managed to join us, and we will see at the end of our webinar if we still have time for her to give updates on the consumer information program. But for now, I will move on to our second speaker. John, can you, the floor is yours, so please go ahead.
Yes, can you put my slides up? Good morning, John Hontelez. I work for FSC as Chief Advocacy Officer, has already been said, and as you can read, Chief Advocacy Officer is a person that focuses on public policies for FSC, including public procurement and timber legality. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, when I started, I thought I can build it up like this, but in the end, my presentation will be a little bit different than this. It was a nice idea to do it like this, but and you will also hear quite a bit of things that have already been said by the previous speakers. Can you go to the next one? So deforestation already been said is currently mainly happening in tropical forest areas. In other parts of the world, in the boreal forest and in the temperate forest, as I call them, there you can see less deforestation in some areas, and in particular also in the EU, even increased of forest areas. But when we look at the role of forests for climate change, biodiversity, and so on, then not only deforestation is important, but also forest degradation. If you replace a natural forest with a plantation, you still have trees. It's still called a forest, but the impact of a plantation is quite different from a natural forest. And in general, forest degradation, and particularly again in the tropics, but not only in the tropics, is many times underestimated as a contribution to climate change. I've seen some studies that show that or estimate that when, for example, the tropical deforestation alone is causing some 12% to 15% of men in anthropogenic, so greenhouse gas emissions, then forest degradation can add something between 8 and 14%. So it's a quite important and often underestimated negative impact of forest degradation. The main drivers for deforestation and forest degradation include conversion to agriculture area, and that can be traditional agriculture or commercial. Already been talked a bit about, and some of the key commodities that we always talk about are soy and palm oil and beef, or sugar sometimes also mentioned, and then also timber, because even if timber is still a timber plantation is still considered a forest, it is one of the big four, they often say, in terms of conversion of natural forests. But also urbanization, infrastructure development, of course, plays a role. Climate change in combination with population pressure, and that you see, of course, a lot in Africa, above the real dense tropical forest. You see that the desert is increasing at the expense of forest and savannas. And then illegal logging and other unsustainable exploitation practices. And unsustainable practices can be caused both by lack of demand. If forests have no value for people, then it's quite, then there is no motive to manage, and then conversion or can be more profitable. And also increase of excessive demand can play a role in forest degradation. Next slide, please. I focus a bit on increased and excessive demand, because that leads, of course, in the end to a role that public procurers can play, because of all these drivers for deforestation, forest degradation. Some cannot be directly addressed by public procurers because they're as consumers, but others can. We know that reducing climate change requires saying goodbye to fossil fuels, and then biomass, including forest biomass, is being seen as one of the solutions. That is increasing demand at the moment on forests, and the risk of unsustainable use, creating carbon debts. But another and probably more systematic and long-term increase of demand is due to the development of bio-based products, which are developed to replace oil as a resource. And then you have to think about replacement of chemicals that we have now, plastics, fibers, and to replace cotton and things like that. So there's more and more interesting new developments based on forest fiber. This is all increasing the demand for forest products. And on the other hand, we also need simply to drive increased demand for timber in order to replace other resources with a higher carbon footprint. And a very clear example is concrete as a main construction material that has a very high carbon footprint in all phases of production and use. And wood is a low carbon replacement. And also when you promote the use of wood for furniture and floorings and so on, it is a low carbon resource, but also in fact you are storing carbon for a longer future instead of when you're using it for biomass, burning it and emitting the carbon. So all these things together, they lead to estimations about quite drastic increase of demand for timber, for wood resources, for timber products. And WF and in the Living Forest a few years ago even estimated the tripling of demand for timber products till 2050. Yes, next one. Now, how to prevent deforestation in terms of timber products, or first of all, now in general first, and as I mentioned, there are several commodities that are more dealing with relevant for food. There are schemes available, there are companies that have committed deforestation-free sourcing, important ones like Unilever. They have both initiated and are playing key role in several of these schemes related to soy, palm oil and so on, but they also, beyond that, they have their own company commitments about zero deforestation sourcing. But for timber, legality is not enough. Legality does not guarantee non-deforestation because there are countries where conversion of forest into plantations on agriculture is simply legal. It's part of their development processes. So just legality does not mean that you are contributing to halting deforestation. The best approach, of course, is, and it's already mentioned also by Annie, the second point at least. First of all, of course, to reduce demand, and that you can think of in terms of in food is less logical unless you're talking about beef, but you can of course reduce demand by focusing on more long living products and on, for example, also in office materials to use it responsibly. You can increasingly focus on recycled materials, but where this is all not possible, forest certification is the third good option. And then when you're focusing particularly on tropical timber or products from tropical timber, then you most often end up with FSC materials, because 81% of the certified materials from forest origin, tropical forest origin, are FSC. Can I see the next slide? So what does FSC do in the forest? We require forest managers to apply management practices that respect our 10 principles. These 10 principles are further developed, specified in criteria, about 60, I believe, and even more recently, we have specified them further in even 200 indicators. Indicators are specific enough for foresters to understand in practice what is expected from them. And as you see, legality is the number one. Then there are several principles that are dealing with social conditions, social rights, humans' rights. So it has a very strong social dimension. And then we have economic and environmental specific requirements. Yes, next one. But this is the first step. We have those requirements for forest management, but in order to this timber reach the consumer and the consumer to have confidence that this is really coming from such forest, we have developed control throughout the supply chain, companies that are processing and trading FSC certified materials. They all have to be certified. They all have to be controlled by third-party organizations, certification bodies. And then at the end, labels give information to consumers about the origin, the FSC origin. And even also the labels are controlled. The use of labels are controlled. It's a copyright, and there is trademark agreements. And so in this way, we're trying to have a near to 100% safe control that FSC name is not abused information to consumers. For public procurers, the labels are not always that relevant because they work with companies that may not, for example, the construction sector, they don't deliver. The house is the product, not wood in the house. And then it's important that you look at the invoices. So claims on invoices are important communication tool as well, but I come back to that. Next slide. There is if you really want to have certified material, it is really possible. Sometimes people think it's very difficult to get, but globally some 430 million hectares is certified in the world. Almost half of that is either only FSC or double certified, and that represents some 30% of all industrial wood produced in the world. So 30%, so normally speaking, 30% of all the wood related products in the world could be from FSC or PFC. In reality, it's a bit less because in the supply chains, things can go wrong in terms of that you lose the identity. That's a pity for, of course, for our promotion, but for us, the most important thing is that 30% of those productive forests do apply our scheme. It comes mostly from temperate and boreal forests. That's a pity for, if you look at the need of tropical forests to have sustainable forest management. We're working on that, but in the tropics it's more difficult. On the other hand, you can also say that most of the products that are appearing on the Western markets are also made from timber from temperate and boreal forests. So there is really no scarcity. Yes. Next one. Then on public procurement, as you all know, public spending represents large parts of the national products of countries. It can depend between 15% in, for example, in Europe, 30% or more in Latin American countries. In the UK, for example, between 30 and 50% of office furniture, that particular market segment is public demand, so it's enormous. And concerted action of public procurers can drive or accelerate change in production consumption patterns. Coordinated preferences of public procurers for certified products can really boost the demand for certified products, and therewith also give clear signals to foresters that a certification is necessary, and it can create price premiums for those foresters that they may need to compensate for the extra cost that they have. And then, as Annie already explained in detail, that when it comes to timber, certification is an important component of sustainable public procurement. She already explained that the alternative of collecting an individual producer collecting evidence about sustainable forest management without relying on FSC or PFC is rather complicated. And as I mentioned, there is a lot of FSC and PFC material on the market, so it's not only reliable, but it's also quite convenient for both the public procurers and the suppliers. However, as Annie already mentioned, in particular for the UK, but UK is there a reflection of the EU legislation. Public procurers, in particular in the UK, have to be quite careful in how they formulate it. In other parts of the world, they have more freedom to simply require sustainable forest management evidence. In the EU, in practice, it is happening quite a lot already for more than a decade. But if you look at the letter of the new EU legislation, you could get into problems if you, for example, start explaining what exactly you require, and particular when it comes to social requirements, there are lawyers that think that you can overstep boundaries. So formulation has to be appropriate. The paradox for me in my work with the EU is that before 2014, when there was a much more general, vaguer legislation, public procurers had more freedom to formulate their sustainable forest management requirements. Now the law is much more detailed and at first glance much more supportive, but the downside of this is that you can also make mistakes. Can I have the next one? Now, forest relevant sustainable public procurement is not only happening in the EU, and it's not only happening on the initiative of governments. It can also be bottom up, and quite often bottom up, and not only in Europe. There are very Latin American cities that by them are as big as the Netherlands or enormous purchasing power. Buenos Aires, equally, the organization of mental cities is promoting systematic citizen initiative, but in the EU, indeed, in many countries, it has become now a national and national rules being made in the Netherlands. There is the Chatham House published an overview which showed that already 22 countries in the EU have some form of national public procurement related to timber. And it mentioned also some 8 other countries outside of the EU, including China, Japan, New Zealand, Switzerland, Norway, but also countries like Ghana, Mexico, and I know that also New Zealand not mentioned, like Chile, Korea, have such policies increasingly. There was something like that, but the Trump administration is apparently winding it down. But several states that have their own timber procurement policies, and that probably will get stronger as a response to the absence of federal policies. Next. The EU legislation, I mentioned already a bit. On the one hand, it does explicitly open the possibility to include social requirements linked to the production process, which is quite important for forest management. We talk then, on the one hand, on labor conditions. Working in the forest is still one of the most dangerous professions in the world. But on the other hand, it's getting complicated if you want explicitly to include rights of indigenous peoples or rights of the forest-dependent people. But I think in the end, public jurisprudence will prove whether that is a problem. Not the question is whether any company would like to sue a public procurer if he requires this kind of things, as long as organizations like FSC and PFC can deliver that. The environmental requirements, there this directive has made big steps forward, in particular that you can put the production process of sustainable forest management even in the technical specifications already, so at the heart of a call for tender. It also mentions sustainable timber as an example. So if people start wondering whether the directive allows such a general concept, then just look at recital 93 of that directive. And it also has a clear chapter about how public procurers can use labels as preferred options of evidence, and that is also progress. But on the other hand, as I mentioned already, there are also some potential risks. And in the FSC has produced for public procurers some guidance on how to do this and how to remain safe in terms of the EU legislation. This is a document which I have listed here on my slide, but unfortunately, as we have a new website just since 1 month, this moment this is not online, but I guess today or tomorrow it might come back. Next slide. My final message is that the devil is in the detail with public procurement and calls for tenders, because there are rules about public procurement to avoid corruption, to avoid promotion of local interests, and so you have to have a clear environmental motivation that is to be quite specific. And another important thing is that if you require certified material in your call for tender, make sure that you actually get it. Research in the Netherlands has shown that, in particular in the construction sector, most local authorities ask for FSC certified wood construction materials, but in many cases then it stops there. If the construction firm says I can't get it, they give up, or even if they say I will do it, then in the end the local authorities are not really paying attention to what happens in reality, and it is quite possible to follow this up until step by step, by using the FSC tools for checking certificates and checking invoices. And we have produced as FSC a specific publication that is addressing public procurers and construction firms on how to realize FSC certification in the construction sector in an effective way. I think that was the last slide, right? So if you have questions now or otherwise, just write me an email.
Great. Many thanks, John, for that very thorough presentation. And I think we've heard two quite interesting perspectives here on how sustainable timber procurement can be realized, and also the type of support and expertise that public procurers need to actually implement that. So I realize we have gone about 15 minutes over our planned time, and I want to apologize for that. We will not have time, I'm afraid, for questions and further updates from the Consumer Information Program, but we are able, as our speaker said, to be contacted by mail, and we will make sure that the slides and recording are also sent to all our participants. So all that rests for me to do is thank again our guest speakers, John and Annie, and wish you all a good day.